The sky burned red over New Prairie when the creature fell from the stars, and the sound it made was like thunder breaking the world in half, and the ground shook. So hard that windows shattered in town and livestock ran wild in their pens, and everyone who saw it coming knew that something terrible had arrived on their peaceful colony. World Lily Carter was in her veterinary clinic when the impact happened, and she was treating a sick hopper when the building shook and medicine bottles fell from shelves and crashed on the floor, and her patient squealed and tried to escape, but she held it gently and whispered calm words until the shaking stopped, and then she heard the sirens begin to wail across the settlement. She ran outside and saw the smoke rising from the wheat fields 3 miles away, and it was black smoke that rose straight up into the sky like a pillar, and she could see flames at the base, and the other colonists were running in the opposite direction toward the evacuation shelters, and someone grabbed her arm and tried to pull her along, but she shook them off and stared at that column of smoke. Mayor Patricia Holden came running up with her emergency tablet in hand, and her face was pale and scared, and she said the scanners showed something alive in that crater, and it was big, and it was putting out readings that made no sense, and the Galactic Council was sending ships to destroy it, and everyone had to evacuate now before the bombardment began. Lee asked what kind of creature it was, and Patricia said the computers could not identify it, but every species in the galactic database marked it as extremely dangerous, and the official classification was voidworm, and that name alone made people run faster toward the shelters because everyone had heard the stories about void worms and how they destroyed entire colonies and killed millions and could not be stopped by any weapon. But Lily was a veterinarian, and she had dedicated her life to helping animals and creatures of all kinds, and something in her could not accept that any living thing should be left to die alone and in pain. And so she made a decision that would change everything, and she grabbed her emergency medical kit from her truck and started walking toward the crater. Patricia shouted after her that she was insane and that she would die, and that the council ships would arrive in 6 hours and turn the entire impact zone into molten glass, and nothing would survive. And Lily should come to the shelters where it was safe, but Lily kept walking, and she did not look back. Walk took her 40 minutes, and with each step, the smoke grew thicker, and the heat grew stronger, and she had to put on a breathing mask to filter the ash from the air, and her boots crunched on burned wheat stalks, and the ground was still warm from the impact, and in some places it had turned to glass. When she reached the edge of the crater, she stopped and stared down into it, and what she saw took her breath away and made her heart pound in her chest, and for a moment she understood why people feared these creatures and why the council wanted to destroy them without hesitation. The creature at the bottom of the crater was massive, and its body was easily 200 feet long, and its scales shimmered with colors that should not exist, and they shifted between deep purple and black. So dark it seemed to absorb light, and its wings were folded against its sides, but even folded they were enormous and covered with what looked like stars and galaxies swirling in the membrane. One wing was twisted at a wrong angle and clearly broken, and there was a wound along its side that leaked something glowing in silver like liquid starlight, and it was breathing hard, and each breath sent ripples through the air around it, and Lily could feel pressure against her mind, like something vast and ancient was trying to communicate but could not find the words. She noticed something else too, and it was something that made her even more determined to help and around the creatures. Neck was a collar, and it was not a natural thing but clearly made by someone with purpose and skill, and it glowed with faint symbols that hurt to look at directly, and that meant this creature belonged to someone, and that someone was probably looking for it. Lily began climbing down into the crater, and the sides were steep and unstable, and twice she slipped and scraped her hands on sharp rocks, but she kept going, and the heat grew more intense the deeper she went, and sweat ran down her face and soaked her clothes, but she did not stop. The creature watched her descend, and its eye was like looking into space itself, and she could see galaxies swirling in that vast orb, and she felt its consciousness touch hers again, and this time there was curiosity mixed with the pain and the wariness, and maybe something like hope. She reached the bottom and approached slowly with her hands visible and empty except for her medical scanner, and she spoke in a calm, gentle voiced the way she would to any frightened animal, and she said she was not there to hurt it, that she wanted to help and that someone clearly cared about it because of that collar, and that someone was probably very worried. Creature made a sound deep in its chest, and the ground vibrated, and it was a warning, but also a test, and Lily understood that, and she kept walking forward slowly and steadily and showing no fear, even though her heart was racing and her hands were shaking. Activated her medical scanner and pointed it at the creature, and the readings made no sense at all, and the scanner kept showing errors and impossible values in the creatures. Biology seemed to exist in multiple states at once, and its cells were flickering between solid matter and pure energy, and nothing in her training had prepared her for this, but Lily had always been good at improvising, and she had treated creatures from a dozen different worlds, and she knew that beneath all the differences, most living things needed the same basic things, and they needed their pain managed and their wounds cleaned in their bodies. Given a chance to heal, she opened her medical kit and pulled out a biofoam injector, and it was designed to seal wounds and promote healing in a wide variety of species, and she had used it on everything from cattle to the strange crystalline creatures that lived in the northern mountains. And she hoped it would work on whatever this creature was. The voidworm watched her prepare the injector, and its eye followed her every movement, and she could feel it analyzing her and judging whether she was a threat or a help. And then slowly, very slowly, it shifted its body and exposed the wound on its side, and that was permission, and that was trust. Lily moved closer, and the heat radiating from the creature was intense, and she had to shield her face with one arm, but she reached out with the injector and pressed it against the edge of the wound and activated it, and the biofoam sprayed out and began sealing the injury, and the creature shuddered, but did not pull a washi. Worked quickly and efficiently and used 3 full canisters of biofoam to seal the major wound, and then she moved to examine the broken wing, and that was more complicated, because she did not understand the wing structure, and the bones seemed to phase in and out of normal space, and touching them made her fingers tingle like electricity. The creature rumbled again, and this time the sound was different and less threatening and almost conversational, and Lily found herself talking to it the way she would to any patient, and she told it about New Prairie and about her clinic and about the fact that the council was coming to destroy it, and that they had less than 6 hours to figure out a solution. She pulled out a support brace from her kit, and it was designed to stabilize broken limbs, and she carefully positioned it around the damaged wing strut and locked it into place, and the creature tensed but allowed her to work, and when she finished it, tested the wing carefully, and seemed satisfied that it would hold. Lily checked her chrono and saw that she had been working for almost an hour, and that meant she had 5 hours left before the council fleet arrived, and she sat down on a rock near her, the creature's head, and wiped sweat from her face and looked at that collar again, and wondered who had made it and where they were. The creature lowered its massive head until it was level with her, and she could see her reflection in that galaxy-filled eye, and she felt its consciousness brush against hers again, and this time there was gratitude and respect and something else, and something that felt like it was trying to tell her that help was coming, and that she should not give up. Hope Lee smiled and reached out slowly and touched the creature's snout, and the scales were warm and smooth and hummed with energy, and she said they would figure this out together, and that she would not let the council destroy something so magnificent and so clearly loved by someone above them. The sky was beginning to darken as the sun set, and soon the stars would come out, and somewhere among those stars, a fleet was approaching with weapons charged and targeting coordinates locked, and Lily knew that tomorrow would bring either salvation or destruction, and there was no way to know which, but for now, in this moment, she was doing what she did best, and she was caring for a creature in need, and that was enough, and that was everything. And the new voidworm seemed to understand that, and it closed its eye and rested, and trusted this strange small human to protect it. The galaxy had learned to fear the voidworms, but Lily Carter had learned something else. And she had learned that even the most fearsome creatures needed compassion and care, and that sometimes the bravest thing anyone could do was refuse to run away. Lily had been working on the voidworm for nearly 3 hours, when reality itself began to tear and the air above the crater started to shimmer and distort like heat. Waves on a summer day, but this was different, and this was wrong. And the wrongness of it made her teeth ache and her eyes water. She looked up from checking the creature's vital signs and saw a line appear in the air, and it was not like a cut or a tear, but more like someone was unzipping the fabric of space itself, and through that opening she could see somewhere else, and it was a place where stars hung. Close and bright, and the darkness between them was filled with colors that had no names in any human language. Through this impossible doorway stepped a figure, and Lily had to blink several times because looking at her directly made her vision blur and her head spin, and she was tall and graceful in a way that seemed almost human but not quite, and there was something about her proportions that was just slightly off in a way that was beautiful and unsettling. At the same time, the woman wore armor that looked like it had been grown rather than forged, and it flowed over her body in organic curves and patterns, and it shimmered with the same impossible colors as the doorway, and her hair was silver and moved in a wind that was not blowing. And when Lily finally managed to look at her face, she saw eyes that held the weight of centuries. The woman's ears came to slight points, and her skin had a faint glow like moonlight on water, and everything about her screamed that she was not human and not from anywhere that humans had ever been. And Lily realized she was looking at something from the old stories and from the legends that every spacefaring species whispered about, but nobody believed were real. The woman looked down at Lillian, then at the voidworm, and her expression shifted from concern to shock to something that might have been anger, and she spoke, and her voice had harmonics that resonated in Lily's chest and made her ribs vibrate. Step away from Shadowmere. Immediately the words were not a request, and they carried weight and authority and the expectation of instant obedience, but Lily had never been good at following orders that made no sense. And she turned back to her scanner and continued checking the creatures. Readings: not until I finish, and your dragon has a ruptured plasma chamber and 3 fractured limb struts, and what I am pretty sure is a dimensional shear running through the left wing, and if we move wrong, Shadowmere could collapse into a singularity. The silence that followed was so complete that Lily could hear her own heartbeat, and she glanced up and saw that the armored woman had frozen completely and was staring at her with an expression of utter disbelief. You know my companion's name, it's on the collar, and beautiful work, by the way, and the runes are self-repairing and very practical. And I am Dr. Lily Carter, and I am a veterinarian. And you are. Lee kept her voice calm and professional the way she would with any worried pet owner. And she had learned long ago that staying focused on the patient was the best way to handle emotionally situations, and this situation was definitely emotional, even if the emotion was coming from an ancient warrior who could probably kill her with a thought. The woman said nothing for a long moment, and the voidworm made a rumbling sound that was different from its earlier warnings. And it was almost conversational, and the woman looked at her companion, and then back at Lily, and something in her expression softened, just slightly. AM Commander Alindra of the Starborn Fleet. And for 3,000 years I have bonded with Shadowmere, and we have fought wars that would make your species weep, and we have burned worlds that threatened the cosmic balance. Alindra descended into the crater with steps that seemed to ignore gravity, and she moved like water flowing downhill, and when she knelt beside her companion, her movement was so graceful that it looked choreographed, and she placed one hand gently on Shadowmere's snout, and the dragon made a pleased rumbling sounding. All that time no one has ever offered to heal him when he was wounded, and they only ran or attacked or tried to bargain for their lives. Well, I am none of those things, and I am a vet, and this is what I duly finished her scan and made notes on her tabletan. Then she pulled out another injector filled with a stimulant that would help boost the creature's natural healing abilities, and she had modified it based on the scanner readings, and she hoped it would work because she was making this up as she went. Alindra watched in silence as Lily administered the injection and positioned another support brace in checked the biofoam seals on the major wound in her ancient eyes, studied this strange human who showed no fear of a creature that had raised star systems and no awe of a starborn who could rewrite reality with a gesture above. Them the evacuation sirens were still wailing, and somewhere in orbit the Galactic Council fleet was preparing their weapons and checking their targeting solutions, and counting down the minutes until they could turn New Prairie into a field of molten glass and erase the voidworm threat forever. Council is coming, and they will not listen to reason, and they never do when it comes to void. Worm Cylindra spoke quietly, and there was something like sadness in her voice, and Lily realized that this ancient warrior had probably seen this scenario play out many times before and had probably lost companions. To the Council's fear and ignorance, Lily stood up and wiped sweat and ash from her face and looked at the elf commander with determination. In her eyes, then, I guess we better give them a reason to listen, and because I did. Not just patch up your dragon, and I documented everything, and I am betting the Council would be very interested to know that these mindless beasts they have been exterminating have owners and intelligent owners, and owners who might take offense to their companions being murdered for the first time in 3,000 years. Alindra smiled, and it was a smile that held danger and amusement in equal measure, and her teeth were just slightly too sharp, and her eyes glowed. Within her fire, you are either very brave or very foolish, Dr. Carter. I am from Texas originally, and we are usually Bofstelmere. Made that rumbling sound again. And this time, it definitely sounded like laughter. And the great creature shifted position carefully to avoid disturbing his healing wounds and looked at Lily with what could only be described as a Provalalindra. Stood, and her armor began to glow brighter, and runes appeared on its surface that had not been visible before, and Lily realized that Commander was preparing for battle and preparing to face an entire fleet if necessary to protect her companion. But Lily had a different idea, and she pulled out her emergency communicator and activated its broadcast mode and linked it to every satellite in orbit and every communication relay on the planet. And when she spoke, her voice would be heard by every ship in the system and every colonist in the shelters and every official in the Council fleet. This is Dr. Lily Carter calling any Council vessels in range, and I am currently treating a wounded void worm on New Prairie, and I am here with the creature's owner, who is Commander Alindra of the Starborn fleet. And before you fire your weapons and commit murder, I suggest you reconsider your understanding of what void worms actually are. The communicator crackled with static, and then a voice responded, and it was deep and gravelly and spoke with the authority of someone who had commanded fleets for decades. This is Admiral Crovan of the Council Extermination Fleet, and Dr. Carter, you need to evacuate immediately, and that creature is a Class 10 threat, and we have authorization to neutralize it by any means necessary. Lindra stepped forward and spoke into the communicator, and her voice carried power that made the device spark and smoke. Admiral Crovan, I am Commander Alindra of the Starborn Fleet, and you have 60 seconds to explain why you were about to fire upon my bonded companion. Silence that followed was absolute, and Lily imagined she could hear the panic spreading through the Council ship's bridge, and every species in the galaxy had legends about the Starborn, and they were the ancient ones who existed before the current galactic civilization, and they wielded powers that made gods jealous, and they intervened in galactic affairs only when the cosmic balance was threatened. Most species considered the myths and old stories told to children, but now one of them was standing in a crater on New Prairie, and she was claiming ownership of a void worm, and she was very clearly not happy about almost losing her companion to an extermination fleet. Your companion and void worms are mindless beasts, and they have destroyed colonies and killed millions. Wild void worms are indeed dangerous, and just as your species ancestors were dangerous before they achieved sentience, and but Shadowmere is not wild, and he is bonded and trained and under my command. And you were about to commit murder, Admiral Lily watched Alindra speak, and saw the way the commander held herself, and the way her hand rested on Shadowmere's neck, and the deep connection between them was obvious, and it was the same connection Lily had seen between countless pets and their owners, and between horses and riders, and between any two beings who had chosen to trust each other completely. Stepped forward again and added her own voice to the transmission. I am Dr. Lily Carter, and I have spent the last several hours treating Commander Alindra's dragon, and I have documented everything, and his biology and his intelligence, markers and the bonding collar and all of it, and the Council has been exterminating bonded companions for how long exactly, Admiral? Croven's voice came back shaken and uncertain. This is unprecedented, and the Galactic Council fleet dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation, and there were 12 dreadnoughts surrounding a massive command carrier, and all their weapons were primed and locked onto New Prairie's surface and ready to fire on command. Admiral Croven of the Zentari Empire stood on his bridge and looked at the tactical display, and he had overseen 43 voidworm exterminations in his long career, and this would be his 44th, and he expected it to be routine like all the others. All ships charge primary weapons, and on my mark we will commence bombardment. Admiral, we are receiving a transmission from the surface, and it is you should see this. The communications officer sounded nervous, and that was unusual because Zentari were not a species that scared easily, and they had thick armored hides and 3 hearts, and they had conquered half their home galaxy before joining the Council, and very little made them nervous. The holographic display flickered to life and showed the crater on New Prairie, and in the center lay the voidworm, and it was wounded but very much alive, and standing beside it were 2 figures, and one was a human woman in dirty work clothes, and the other was an armored warrior whose very presence made every sensor on the ship scream warnings. Greetings, Admiral Crovan, and I am Commander Alindra of the Starborn Fleet, and you have 60 seconds to explain why you were about to fire upon my bonded companion. The bridge went completely silent, and Admiral Croven felt his middle heart skip a beat, and every species in the Council had legends of the Starborn and the Ancient Ones who existed before the current galactic civilization, and who wielded powers that defied all known physics, and who could destroy fleets with a gesture, and who intervened in galactic affairs only when absolutely necessary. Most Council members considered them myths and old stories and comforting lies told to make the universe seem less empty and less cold. But now one stood on that screen, and she was claiming ownership of a voidworm, and she did not look pleased. Your companion and void Wyrms are mindless beasts, and they have destroyed colonies and killed millions, and we have documentation of over 200 incidents. Admiral Croven tried to keep his voice steady, but his throat sac was deflating, and that was a sign of fear in his species, and everyone on the bridge could see it. Wild void Wyrms are indeed dangerous, and just as your species ancestors were dangerous before they learned to think and to build and to dream, but Shadowmere is not wild, and he is bonded and trained and under my command, and you were about to commit murder. Admiral, the human woman stepped forward then, and Admiral Croven was surprised because humans were relatively new to the galactic community, and they were considered naive and idealistic and too emotional for serious diplomatic work, and yet this one showed no fear at Allium. Dr. Lily Carter, and I have just spent the last 6 hours treating Commander Alindra's dragon, and I have documented everything in his biology and his intelligence markers and the bonding collar and all of it, and the Council has been exterminating bonded companions. For how long exactly? Admiral Croven looked at his science officer, was frantically checking databases and historical records, and the officer looked up with wide eyes and confirmed that there were indeed reports of void Wyrms with unusual markings and collars and other signs of domestication, but those reports had been dismissed as sensor errors or misidentifications. Is unprecedented, and we had no knowledge that void Wyrms could be bonded. Ignorance is not an excuse. Commander Alindra's voice cut through the transmission like a blade, and Admiral Croven saw her raise one hand, and the air around her began to shimmer and glow, and every sensor on every ship in the fleet started showing impossible readings. For centuries, members of my people have searched for lost companions scattered across the galaxy and void Wyrms who slipped through dimensional rifts, and who were separated from their bond mates, and who were wounded and crashed on populated worlds in each time before. We could find them, your council killed them. The fleet weapons officer reported that their targeting systems were malfunctioning, and their shields were fluctuating, and something was interfering with their power cores, and Admiral Croven realized, with growing horror, that the Starborn was demonstrating just a fraction of her power. Could end your entire fleet with a thought. Admiral and I could turn your ships inside out, and I could send you all into dimensions where physics does not work the way you expect, and I could do it without even trying hard, but Dr. Carter has convinced me that humanity at least deserves better. Alindra gestured, and one of the smaller escort ships suddenly found itself 3 light years away, and its crew frantically trying to figure out what had happened, and a moment later was back in formation and completely unharmed, but the message was clear. So instead I offer you a choice, and acknowledge that void worms are protected beings, and establish proper protocols for handling them, and make reparations for those you have killed. And/or I will personally visit every council world and demonstrate exactly why the Starborn do not involve themselves in your affairs, because we are too dangerous to your continued existence. Admiral Croven looked at his command staff and saw fear in every face, and he looked at his weapons console and knew that nothing they had could harm a Starborn, and he looked at the human veterinarian standing calmly beside a creature that could crack planets, and made his decision. I will need to consult with the full council. You have 1 standard week, and in the meantime this planet is under Starborn protection, and any ship that approaches with hostile intent will learn why we are feared. The transmission ended, and Admiral Croven ordered his fleet to withdraw to a safe distance, and then he sent an emergency message to the council chambers on the capital world, and he explained what had happened and what he had seen and what Commander Alindra had threatened. The council met in emergency session, and representatives from 73 species gathered in the great chamber, and they argued and debated and shouted at each other for hours. Some wanted to declare war on the Starborn, and some wanted to ignore the threat, and some wanted to negotiate. But in the end they voted to accept Alindra's demands, and they had no choice, because fighting the Starborn was suicide, and ignoring them was worse, and the only sensible option was to acknowledge that they had been wrong, and that void worms with bondmates were not mindless beasts but intelligent companions who deserved protection. The new protocols were written quickly, and they specified that any void worm found with a collar or other signs of bonding must be treated as a protected being, and that killing one would be considered murder, and that anyone who found a wounded void worm should contact the Starborn fleet immediately, and that reparations would be paid to the families of those companions who had been killed by council. For it was a humiliating defeat for the council, and many representatives voted against the measures, but not enough to stop them, and the laws were passed and transmitted to every E-Council world and every military vessel and every law enforcement agency on New Prairie. Lily continued to monitor Shadowmere's recovery, and the dragon was healing remarkably fast, and his wounds were closing, and his broken wing was mending, and the dimensional shear was stabilizing. Within 3 days he was able to stand and stretch his wings. Alindra remained with them the entire time, and she told Lily stories of the Starborn and of the old wars, and of the time before the council, when the galaxy was younger and more dangerous and more filled with wonder. Lily learned that the Starborn were not a species, but a transformation, and they had been regular beings once from dozens of different species, but they had touched something ancient and powerful, and it had changed them and given them abilities that bent reality itself. She learned that void worms were native to a dimension where time flowed differently and where space was more suggestion than law, and that they could only survive in normal space if bonded to a Starborn who could anchor them and protect them and help them navigate the rigid rules of conventional physics. She learned that Shadowmere was not just Alindra's companion, but her partner and her equal, and that they shared thoughts and feelings and memories, and that losing him would have been like losing half her soul. And Alindra learned about humanity and about their strange combination of compassion and stubbornness, and their refusal to accept that anything was impossible, and their tendency to adopt and protect anything they considered part of their pack. You are an unusual species, Dr. Carter, and most species either fear us or worship us. but you simply treated me like any other worried pet owner. Bringing in a sick animal, Lily smiled and checked her scanner one more time. Well, med is what you are, and worried pet owner, I mean. And the fact that you can reshape reality does not change. That and Shadowmere needed help, and you needed someone to help him, and that is all that mattered. Then the 5th day after the Council's decision, a ship arrived in orbit, and it was a starborn vessel, and it looked like it had been grown from crystal and starlight, and it was beautiful and terrible and utterly alien Elendra. Prepared to leave, and Shadowmere was fully healed now and ready to return home, and the dragon had grown fond of Lily, and he rumbled sadly when she told him goodbye, and he lowered his massive head so she could pat his snout one last time. Take care of yourself, big guy, and try not to crash on any more colony worlds. 3 days after the council agreed to protect bonded void worms, the piece shattered like glass, and Lily was in her temporary medical station near the crater checking Shadowmere's final healing reports when the first explosion rocked the ground and sent her stumbling against the equipment table. She ran outside and looked up at the sky and saw ships descending through the clouds, and there were dozens of them, and they all bore the crimson insignia of something called the Purity Legion. And their weapons were already firing, and their targets were clear. The Legion had come to finish what the Council had started. And they did not care about new laws or new protocols or ancient warriors who could bend reality, because they believed that some things were too dangerous to exist, and that allowing dimensional abominations to live set a terrible precedent for the galaxy. Elendra materialized beside Lily in a swirl of displaced air, and her armor was now fully configured for battle. And runes blazed across its surface with deadly light, and her eyes glowed like stars, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 3,000 years of war. They mean to kill Shadowmere and make it look like we attacked first, and the Legion believes that if they can eliminate one void worm and its bonded starborn, they can justify a galaxy-wide purge of anything they consider impure. That is insane. That is fanaticism. And Dr. Carter, you need to evacuate, and what comes next will not be safe for you. Lee grabbed her medical kit and planted her feet and looked Elendra in the eye with pure, stubborn determination. Not a chance, and Shadowmere is not fully healed, and he is still vulnerable, and I do not abandon Pachins. Elendra stared at her for a long moment, and then something like respect flickered across her ancient face. Very well, Dr. Butt, stay behind me, and what you are about to witness is why the galaxy fears the bonded pairs above them. Shadowmere roared, and the sound was like reality itself breaking, and it bent the air and made the attacking ships falter in their approach. And despite his recent injuries, the dragon rose to his full height and spread his wings and cast a shadow that seemed to contain entire galaxies. The Legion ships opened fire, and plasma bolts and missiles streaked down toward the crater, and Elendra raised both hands, and the weapons simply stopped in midair and hung there frozen. And then she closed her fists, and the weapons reversed course and shot back toward the ships that had fired them, and 3 Legion vessels exploded instantly. Shadowmere launched himself skyward with powerful beats of his cosmic wings, and he moved with a grace that belied his massive size. And when he roared again, the sound became physical force and shattered 2 more ships like they were made of paper. But the Legion kept coming, and they had numbers, and they had fanaticism, and they were willing to sacrifice everything to prove their point, and to show the galaxy that humans who sided with abominations would die alongside them. Lily watched from behind a reinforced barrier that Elendra had created, and her mind raced. And this was more than just a battle, and this was a message, and the Legion wanted to make New Prairie an example, and they wanted to show what happened to anyone who protected creatures they deemed too dangerous to life. She could not let that happen, and she would not let these fanatics destroy everything she had worked for and everything Elendra and Shadowmere represented. And so she made another decision, and she activated her emergency broadcast system and linked it to every communication relay in the system. Elendra, and I need you to trust me, and can you and Shadowmere hold them for 2 minutes? The commander did not question and did not hesitate, and she simply nodded. Kennelly began recording, and her hands were steady, despite the explosions happening around her, and despite the ships burning in the sky, and despite the knowledge that she might not survive the next few minutes. My name is Dr. Lily Carter, and I am a veterinarian from New Prairie, and I am standing in a war zone right now because I made a choice to treat a wounded animal. And that animal happens to be a void worm named Shadowmere, and his owner is Commander Alindra of the Starborn Fleet and other. Ship exploded overhead and debris rained down, but Lily did not flinch, and she kept speaking. Right now, the Purity Legion is trying to kill all three of us because they believe that some lives do not deserve protection, and the Galactic Council has officially recognized void worms as protected beings, but the Legion is attacking in direct violation of Council law. Looked directly into the camera, and her voice was firm and clear. They are not heroes fighting monsters, and they are fanatics committing murder. And if we let them do this here, they will do it everywhere. And today, it is Shadowmere. And tomorrow, it will be any species they decide does not fit their definition of pure. Lily paused and let that sink in, and she knew her words were being broadcast across the entire sector, and that millions of beings were watching. I am broadcasting this across the galaxy, and everyone is watching, and choose wisely, Legion, because if you kill us, you will do it in front of everyone and humanity. Does not forget, and we do not forgive, and we definitely do not let bullies win. The broadcast ended, and for 3 heartbeats nothing changed, and the Legion ships continued their assault, and Alindra and Shadowmere continued their desperate defense, and Lily wondered if she had just signed her own death warrant then. The sky lit up with new arrivals, and they came in waves and dropped out of hyperspace in a loose but determined formation, and they were human ships, and hundreds of them there were colony defense forces with outdated but functional weapons, and merchant vessels that had been hastily retrofitted with whatever guns they could mount, and civilian transports that had no business being in a combat zone but had come anyway. And even a few military cruisers that had been patrolling nearby systems. They surrounded New Prairie like a protective shell, and their transponders all broadcast the same simple message, and it said, touch her and find out what humans do to protect their own. Legion hesitated, and they had expected to face 1 starborn and 1 wounded dragon and 1 foolish veterinarian. But now they were facing hundreds of ships, and they were outgunned and outmaneuvered, and more importantly, they were committing their atrocities in front of the entire galaxy, with human ships recording every moment. Admiral Croven's voice cut through the chaos, and he sounded angry and embarrassed. Purity Legion vessels, you are ordered to stand down immediately, and by Council law, you are in violation of multiple treaties and conventions, and you will cease your attack or face the full consequences. Legion Commander snarled back over the open channel, and his voice was filled with hate and self-righteousness. We do not recognize the Council's authority in this matter, and we will purge this dimensional filth, even if we must go through every human ship to do it, and we will cleanse the galaxy of these abominations. Selindra's voice was cold as the space between stars then. You will die in the process. She raised both hands, and reality screamed, and what she unleashed was older than civilizations, and older than most stars, and it was the fundamental force that had created the Starborn in the first place. The Legion ships found their weapons firing backwards into their own holes, and their shields inverting to trap them rather than protect them, and their engines accelerating them toward each other in a deadly ballet that ended in fire and destruction. Edid his power to hers, and the dragon became something more than physical, and he existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. And where he flew, space itself tore and folded, and Legion ships were crushed by gravity waves or frozen in time, or simply ceased to exist for 10 minutes. The battle raged, and Lily watched in awe and terror as Alindra and Shadowmere demonstrated what they truly were, and they were not just warrior and mount, but 2 halves of a single devastating whole. And they were perfectly synchronized, and perfectly deadly, and absolutely unstoppable. The Legion broke, and those ships that could still move fled into hyperspace, and those that could not surrendered or self-destructed, rather than face capture, and in less than 15 minutes. The assault force that had numbered over 100 ships was reduced to scattered wreckage and desperate retreat. Human fleet held position around New Prairie, and they did not pursue the fleeing Legion ships, but their presence was a clear message, and anyone who wanted to try again would have to go through them. First, Lily emerged from behind her barrier on shaking legs but with her head held high and around New Prairie. The colonists were cheering and celebrating, and probably planning another party, but all Lily could think about was checking on her Pachytaeldra, descended from the sky and landed beside Lily with otherworldly grace, and her armor was scorched and smoking, and her silver hair was disheveled, but her eyes held something that might have been satisfaction, that was the most reckless and foolish and brilliant thing I have seen. In 3,000 years, and you rallied an entire species to protect one? Dragon 1, patient and his very stubborn owner Shadowmere landed nearby, and the ground shook with his weight, and Lee immediately pulled out her scanner and began checking his vital signs and making sure the battle had not reopened any of his healing wounds. "How are you feeling, Big Geetha?" Dragon lowered his massive head and allowed her to examine him, and he rumbled affectionately. And Lily smiled because, despite everything, despite the battle and the danger and the ships burning in orbit, her patient was going to be not. Council will have no choice but to enforce their original agreement. 3 weeks had passed since the battle, and new Prairie had returned to something resembling normal life, and the colonists had repaired the damage, and the crops were growing again, and life continued as it always did after crisis and chaos. Lily knew that nothing would ever truly be the same, and the galaxy had changed, and humanity had announced itself as a species, willing to stand up for what was right, and willing to protect those who needed protection, regardless of the Costalindra. And Shadowmere remained on the colony as promised, and the Starborn commander had set up a small camp near the crater, and she spent her days meditating and training, and occasionally answering questions from curious colonists who were brave enough to approach Lee, visited them daily, and she brought reports on the SD's progress, and on the new legislation being written, and on the changing attitudes across the galaxy toward both void worms and the species who protected them. The Council has officially established the Protected Companion Registry, and any bonded creature must be registered and given full legal rights in killing. One is now classified as murder in all member system. Salandra nodded, and she was sitting on a rock near Shadowmere, and the dragon was dozing in the afternoon sun, and his scales shimmered with peaceful colors. It is progress and more than I expected in such a short time, and your species has a gift for forcing change. Dr. Carter, we also have a gift for stubbornness, and my grandmother used to say that Carter women were too stubborn to know when to quit. The elf smiled, and it was a genuine smile without the weight of centuries behind it, like your grandmother already. Lily sat down on a nearby rock and pulled out her tablet, and she had been thinking about something for days, and now seemed like the right time to mention. Heidi received a message from the Starborn fleet, and they want to know if I would be interested in becoming their official Voidworm veterinarian, and apparently you have several hundred more dragons that could use regular checkups. Alindra looked at her with surprise and interest. You would leave your home and your clinic and your peaceful life to treat creatures that most of the galaxy still fiercely looked at Shadowmere. And the massive dragon cracked one eye open and looked back at her with that galaxy-filled gaze, and she felt the same connection she had felt when she first climbed into that crater and decided to help instead of Rooney, became a veterinarian, because I wanted to help creatures that could not help themselves. And I wanted to make a difference in lives that mattered, and treating hoppers and cattle is good work and important work, but this, and what we did here, and this changed everything. She stood and walked over to Shadowmere and placed one hand on his warm scales and felt the hum of dimensional energy beneath her palm. How many more Shadowmeres are out there, and how many more bonded companions need someone who understands them and who can treat their injuries and who can document their biology so that future generations know how to care for the Melandra? Stood as well, and her expression was unreadable. Be dangerous, and you would travel to places where physics does not work as you expect, and you would meet beings that would terrify most humans, and you would be far from everything you know and everything familiar. Lee grinned, and it was the same stubborn grin she had worn when she climbed into a crater toward a creature that could have killed her with a thought. Sounds perfect. And when do we start for the third time in 3,000 years? Alendra laughed, and it was a sound like bells and thunder and pure joy. Next week, and we will start your training immediately, and you will need to learn dimensional navigation and energy medicine, and how to communicate with beings that exist partially outside normal space. And it will be the most challenging work of your life. Am from Texas, and we like challenge Shoutor rumbled his approval, and the sound made the ground vibrate, and birds took flight from nearby trees, and the dragon rose to his feet and stretched his wings in a display that never got old, no matter how many times Lily saw it. The news of Lily's decision spread quickly through New Prairie and the colonists through another party because they seemed to love any excuse for celebration, and Mayor Patricia gave another speech about bravery and following your dreams and making a difference in the galaxy. But Lily could see the sadness beneath the celebration, and these people had been her neighbors and her friends and her patients for 5 years, and leaving them was not easy, even for a good cause. Dr. Simmons arrived from the capital world to take over her clinic, and he was a competent veterinarian with experience treating exotic species, and Lily spent 3 days showing him around and introducing him to all her regular patients, and making sure he understood the quirks of New Prairie livestock, take good care of them, and especially Old Blue, and he is the hopper with the scar on his left ear, and he gets nervous during thunderstorms and needs extra attention. Dr. Simmons smiled and shook her hand. You are a legend now. Dr. Carter and the veterinarian who saved a dragon and stood up to the council and inspired humanity to protect the helpless, and those are big shoes to fill, but I will do my best. Just take care of the animals, and everything else is just noise. On her last day on New Prairie, the entire colony gathered to say goodbye, and children asked for autographs, and adults thanked her for what she had done, and everyone wanted to know what it was like to touch a dragon, and Lily answered every question with patience and grace. When the goodbyes were finished, she walked to the crater one last time, and Alindra was waiting with Shadowmere and the starborn vessel hung in the sky above them like a crystal moon. Are you ready, Dr. Carter? Lily looked back at the colony, and at the life she was leaving behind, and at the comfortable, familiar existence she had built, and then she looked at Shadowmere, and at the vast unknown that awaited, and at the chance to do something no human had ever done before. Am ready, Alindra gestured, and reality folded around them, and suddenly they were standing inside the starborn vessel, and the interior was unlike anything Lily had ever seen, and walls curved in directions that should not exist, and light came from everywhere and nowhere, and gravity seemed optional. Welcome to the celestial wing, and this will be your home for the foreseeable future, and your quarters are prepared, and your medical bay is equipped with the best equipment we could provide, though you will likely need to improvise often. Lily walked through the corridors and marveled at everything, and she passed other starborn, and they nodded to her with respect, and she saw other void worms resting in vast chambers that seemed bigger on the inside than they should be. Her medical bay was incredible, and it had scanners and tools she had never seen before, and equipment that could analyze beings from multiple dimensions simultaneously, and a surgery suite that could adjust gravity and time flow as needed. But what caught her attention most was the wall of windows that looked out into space, and she could see stars and nebulas and distant galaxies, and for the first time in her life, she truly understood how vast the universe was and how much was waiting to be explored. Adamer appeared in the doorway, and he had to fold himself to fit, but he squeezed inside and rumbled a greeting, and Lily walked over and patted his snout. Ready for your first official checkup as my permanent patient. Dragon made that laughing sound and lay down, and allowed Lily to run her scanners over him and check his vital signs and examine his healing progress, and everything looked perfect. You are in excellent health, big guy, and I could not ask for a better first patient over. The following months, Lily adapted to her new life, and she learned to navigate spaces where up and down were suggestions rather than rules, and she learned to treat injuries that existed across multiple dimensions, and she learned to communicate with void worms through a combination of touch and empathy and shared consciousness. She traveled to worlds that defied description and met beings that challenged everything she thought. She knew about biology and physics and consciousness, and she documented it all and created the first comprehensive medical guide for voidworm care. Word spread through the galactic community about the human veterinarian who worked with the starborn, and other species began reaching out and asking for help with their own exotic companions, and Lily found herself becoming an ambassador as much as a doctor. The council issued a formal apology for their past actions and established reparations for families who had lost bonded companions, And they created new protocols for handling unknown species, and they mandated that first contact situations be approached with caution and compassion rather than fear and violence. Eldra watched Lily's work with approval, and the ancient warrior had found in this human something she had not expected, and a friend and an equal, and someone who understood that power came in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest strength was the courage to care. 1 year after leaving New Prairie, Lily received a message from her old colony, and Mayor Patricia wanted to know how she was doing and if she was happy and if she regretted her decision. Lily recorded her response while standing in her medical bay with Shadamir dozing nearby, and with stars streaming past the windows at speeds that made them blur into ribbons of light. I'm doing wonderful, and I have treated 53 different void worms and learned more about dimensional biology than I ever thought possible, and made friends with beings from across the galaxy. And no, I do not regret anything. She paused and smiled at the camera.